Okay, let's unpack this. Today, we're taking a deep dive into something that might sound like a pretty dense piece of legislation, but it actually has profound implications for your money, your privacy, and maybe even the whole structure of the U.S. economy. We're talking about the Genius Act. That's the Guiding and Establishing National Innovation for U.S. Stablecoins Act, passed in 2025.
Right. And what's fascinating here is how this act, which, is presented as a move toward regulatory clarity and innovation, well, it's really ignited a fierce debate.
How so?
Well, on one side, you have proponents claiming it tames the Wild West of digital assets, taming the chaos.
Okay.
But then critics warn it's more like a Trojan horse, something that actually dismantles financial protections and shifts, well, immense risk onto the public.
So our mission in this deep dive is really to cut through that noise, understand both sides. We've got a stack of sources here, government reports, financial analyses, even the bill itself.
Yeah, dug deep into the text.
And we want to extract the most important nuggets of knowledge for you. We'll look at the landscape before this law, break down its key parts, uncover the potential impacts, and, talk about who wins and who might lose out.
Who's left holding the bag, basically.
Exactly. You're about to get a shortcut to being well-informed on what could be one of the most significant financial shifts of our time.
Did a big one.
So to really get the Genius Act, we need to set the stage. What did the U.S. digital asset world actually look like before this law?
Yeah, for years it was. Well, people often described it as chaotic, a high-stakes frontier. A modern Wild West really sums it up.
Wild West, okay.
There just wasn't a comprehensive federal framework for stablecoins. Instead, you had this, confusing patchwork of state money transmitter laws.
Right.
Which created a big legal gray area. And importantly, it led to this kind of turf war between the big federal regulators.
You mean the SEC and CFTC?
Exactly. So the SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission, under the Biden administration, they went for regulation by enforcement. Lots of high-profile lawsuits, right?
Yeah.
Coinbase, Binance, Kraken.
Yeah.
They basically saw most digital assets as unregistered securities. But then the CFTC, the Commodity Futures Trading Commission, they called Bitcoin and Ethereum commodities.
So a fundamental conflict.
Total conflict.
Yeah.
Massive uncertainty for the industry. They didn't know which rules applied.
And while the regulators were battling it out, what about regular people, consumers? Were they protected?
Largely, no. There weren't federal rules for, plain language disclosures or how to resolve disputes or even guaranteed help if you got hacked or fell victim to fraud.
So like you said, a playground for insiders maybe and a minefield for the public.
That's a fair way to put it, yeah.
Yeah.
And the consequences. They became terrifyingly clear in 2022. First, remember Terra Luna?
Oh, yeah. That was huge.
Vaporized about $45 billion, almost overnight. Terra USD was an algorithmic stablecoin, meaning it wasn't really backed by, actual dollars or assets.
Right, use algorithms.
And when confidence dipped, it just entered this death spiral. Sophisticated investors, they got out quick. Retail investors, lured by these crazy 19.5% yields,
Right.
they were left holding the bag.
So the lesson there was?
Pretty unequivocal, really. A stablecoin is only stable if it's fully backed, one-to-one, by high-quality liquid reserves, cash, treasuries, that sort of thing.
Okay, lesson one, backing is critical. But then, just 6 months later, boom, FTX implodes.
Right.
And that seemed like a different kind of problem. Sam Bankman-Fried, $8 billion in custodial funds funneled to his hedge fund, Alameda Research.
Exactly. FTX taught a different but maybe equally crucial lesson. One-to-one asset backing. It's kind of meaningless if you don't have strict rules stopping the company from, mixing customer funds with their own or reusing those funds.
Commingling.
Commingling, yeah. And you need enforcement. Rigorous, independent, frequent audits to make sure those rules are followed. And as we'll get into, the Genius Act, it pays lip service to the first lesson, the backing, but critics say it creates some dangerous loopholes around the second one, the audits and the commingling.
So let's connect this to, the average American saving for retirement. Crypto was this Wild West, but retirement accounts, 401ks, pensions, they've historically been pretty heavily protected, right? It's like ERISA.
Exactly right. ERISA, the Employee Retirement Income Security Act, imposes strict fiduciary duties. Managers have to act in the best interest of the savers. The whole system is designed for, conservative wealth accumulation, plus tax advantages, contribution limits.
Yeah.
For 2025, what is it? $23,500 for 401ks,
Yeah.
$7,000 for IRAs.
Right.
Now, back in 2022, the Biden administration's Department of Labor, They put out guidance telling 401k fiduciaries to use extreme care with crypto, cited significant risks of fraud, theft, and losses.
So basically walled off those trillions in retirement savings from crypto.
Pretty much, yeah. But that protective guidance was rolled back, rescinded by the Trump administration in 2025. And that, according to critics, was a really critical political move. It basically unlocked the door for the Genius Act to potentially expose all those retirement savings to, well, unprecedented risk.
Okay, so that sets the stage. Now, the Genius Act itself, it was sold as this landmark law to tame that Wild West. Let's break down what it actually does, starting with this core definition, the permitted payment stablecoin. What's so revolutionary about that?
This is the legislative masterstroke the crypto industry spent millions lobbying for.
Okay.
The act explicitly says a permitted payment stablecoin is not a security and it's not a commodity.
So it just creates a whole new box for it.
Exactly.
Right.
New, bespoke asset class. And by doing that, it surgically removes stablecoins from the main oversight of the SEC and the CFTC.
And puts them where?
Puts them under a new, kind of fragmented and pretty untested regulatory system, mostly run by banking regulators. Proponents say, great, clarity, innovation.
Right. A specific lane.
Yeah. But critics worry about who those regulators are and how fragmented it is.
Okay. And a huge selling point you mentioned was the reserve requirement. Strict 1.1 backing. Every stablecoin backed by high-quality liquid assets, cash, insured deposits, short-term T-bills. Sounds like it prevents another Terra Luna.
It's definitely aimed at that. And proponents really emphasize this for consumer safety. One-to-one backing.
But is it airtight?
Well, critics point to what they see as a critical loophole, kind of buried in the text. It prohibits rehypothecation, that's lending out or pledging the reserves.
Okay, good.
Except, and this is the key part, except for, quote, creating liquidity to meet reasonable expectations of request to redeem payment stablecoins.
What does that mean in practice?
Critics say it's a gaping hole. It gives the issuers discretion. They can encumber their reserves, use them for other things, basically, which introduces counterparty risk that the assets aren't really there when needed. And Senator Elizabeth Warren, for instance, she's warned that even the definition of high-quality assets is dangerously loose. Could allow risky stuff, maybe like the assets that caused trouble back in 2008 or 2020.
Okay, so potential wiggle room on the reserves. Now, who actually gets to issue these stablecoins? Who gets to print this private money? Sounds like it changes that old separation of banking and commerce.
It absolutely does. It creates this dual system. On one hand, traditional banks can issue them, well, subsidiaries of insured banks.
Okay.
But also a whole new class of non-bank tech companies. Fintech firms with special charters from the OCC or state chartered trust companies, as long as they're under $10 billion.
So big tech firms could issue their own money.
That's the implication critics raise. Proponents say it spurs competition, innovation, and payments. Critics worry it sets the stage for, massive corporations issuing their own branded currencies, giving them huge economic and maybe social power.
And who's watching the store? Instead of one big regulator like the SEC, it sounds like oversight is fragmented.
It is. Primary authority is split. Federal banking regulators, the OCC, the Fed, the FDIC, and then this patchwork of state banking supervisors.
And you mentioned someone's missing.
Yeah. Conspicuously, the CFPB, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, is largely shut out. No real oversight role here. And the Act actually encourages this fragmentation. It allows states to create their own substantially similar rules. Critics argue this just incentivizes a race to the bottom, states competing to be the most attractive, meaning the most lenient, to crypto businesses.
Regulatory arbitrage.
That's the term they use, yeah. Not a system built for tough enforcement, maybe more for finding the easiest regulator.
Okay, what about transparency? The Act requires monthly reports on reserves, certified by the CEO and CFO. Sounds good.
Critics call it transparency theater, because these are just attestations. It's the company saying, yep, the reserves are there. It's not an independent check.
Not a real audit.
A full independent third-party audit by a registered accounting firm that's only required annually, and only for the really big issuers over $50 billion.
Wow, annually.
For most issuers, the public is just taking the company's word for it for up to a year. After FTX, well, critics say relying on executive self-certification as the main safeguard is. Maybe regulatory negligence.
Right. And finally, the Act is very clear. Stablecoins aren't legal tender. They're not FDIC insured. The government isn't legally required to bail out consumers if one collapses. But what about that implicit guarantee?
Yeah, the disclaimer is there in black and white. But critics argue it's pretty meaningless in the real world.
Yeah.
Because by creating this formal federal charter, this licensing system, this supervision, the U.S. government is effectively lending its good name, its full faith and credit to these private products.
So people will just assume they're safe because they're federally permitted.
Exactly. And that creates, critics say, a dangerous moral hazard. Issuers can take risks, capture the profits if things go well.
Knowing the government might have to step in if they fail to prevent a bigger crisis.
Precisely. The precedent was set, clear as day, in March 2023. Right. Silicon Valley Bank fails. Federal regulators step in, guarantee all deposits way above the FDIC limit. And that saves Circle's $3.3 billion in cash reserves held there.
Ah, okay.
The market learned its lesson that day. The government will intervene if the failure is big enough. Critics argue the Genius Act basically codifies this situation. It privatizes the profits, but socializes the potential losses onto taxpayers.
Okay, let's bring this back to, everyday people saving for retirement. What does this mean for their 401ks, their IRAs, maybe pensions? Does the Genius Act break down those protective walls we talked about?
That's a major concern raised by critics, yes. Now, the Act doesn't explicitly force stablecoins into retirement plans. It's not this is a mandate.
Okay.
But it does provide that crucial stamp of federal legitimacy, that federally permitted status we just discussed.
Right.
Combine that with the Trump administration rescinding that Biden-era Labor Department guidance, the one warning fiduciaries about crypto risks. Mm-hmm. And critics say it acts as a clear green light. The new administration's policy is asset class neutrality, which basically could pave the way for stablecoins, and maybe by extension other more volatile crypto assets, to become core investment options in those retirement plans.
And it's not just individual 401ks we're talking about, right? It could affect big pension funds too, like for teachers, firefighters. You mentioned state-level trends.
Indeed. We're seeing movement there already. In Florida, for instance, legislation was introduced, didn't pass yet, I believe, but introduced to let its huge public pension fund invest up to 10% of its assets in Bitcoin.
Wow, 10%.
Yeah. And other states, Arizona, New Hampshire, Texas, they're setting up state-level Bitcoin reserves. Critics argue the Genius Act just pours fuel on this fire. It gives pension fund trustees the regulatory cover they might feel they need to make these kinds of, well, risky, unconventional investments that would have been unthinkable just a few years back.
This really feels like it could erode that fiduciary standard, that duty to be prudent, which has been the bedrock of retirement security for, half a century? What stands out to you about that potential erosion?
Well, it raises a really fundamental question, doesn't it? Under ERISA, prudence usually means picking investments that are well understood, have long track records, things you can reasonably predict.
Right. Stocks, bonds.
Exactly. Cryptocurrencies, critics point out, just don't fit that mold. They have no long track record. They're complex, often opaque, subject to wild volatility, fraud, manipulation.
So if these become options, fiduciaries are caught in a tough spot.
That's the argument. They're stuck between pressure, maybe from plan participants or employers, to offer these hot new things, and the very real threat of lawsuits down the road from retirees who suffer catastrophic losses if, say, a stablecoin collapses or their Bitcoin investment tanks.
And let's talk practicality. What does happen if a stablecoin breaks its peg or an issuer just goes bust? For someone relying on that retirement money, who holds the bag?
For the retirement saver. The outcome, critics paint it pretty starkly.
Yeah.
Their money's probably gone.
Just gone.
Yeah. There's no FDIC insurance like a bank account. Now, the Act does give stablecoin holders priority over other creditors if the issuer goes bankrupt.
Okay, so they're first in line.
First in line among creditors, yes. But financial history shows us bankruptcy proceedings can take years, and often even priority creditors only get back pennies on the dollar. For someone who's retired or close to it, that kind of loss is devastating, irreversible.
This is sounding chillingly familiar. People are drawing parallels to 2008. Is that a fair comparison?
Many critics definitely draw that parallel. They argue the whole structure of risk being built here directly echoes the conditions leading up to the 2008 crisis.
How so?
In this view, stablecoins are kind of like the new mortgage-backed securities, the MBSs, complex products, maybe not fully understood, but marketed as safe.
Okay.
And just like MBSs got bundled into even more complex things like CDOs, collateralized debt obligations.
Right.
Stablecoins are becoming the base layer, the collateral, for this huge sprawling, often unregulated world of decentralized finance, or DeFi.
Okay. So a failure in stablecoins wouldn't stay in stablecoins.
That's the critical warning from critics. A failure at that base layer, say a major stablecoin like USDC or Tether, collapses. It wouldn't be contained. It could trigger this cascade of liquidations all through DeFi. Forced selling, margin calls, creating contagion that would inevitably spill over into traditional finance because the systems are now so intertwined, thanks in part to the legitimacy granted by the Genius Act.
So it's not just inviting risk, it's potentially hardwiring it into the whole economy.
That's the argument, yes.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit. Talk about the forces behind this law. Critics argue the Genius Act wasn't just good public policy evolving, but the result of a pretty massive influence campaign. Who are the key players pushing for this?
Yeah, the crypto industry has become, well, a really formidable lobbying force very quickly. They poured millions into campaign donations, lobbying efforts, especially around the 2024 election cycle.
Any specific groups?
Key groups like the Crypto Council for Innovation were very active. And you also see what critics call the revolving door effect. Former politicians moving into the industry.
Like who?
A prime example cited is former Republican Representative Patrick McHenry. He chaired the House Financial Services Committee, was deeply involved in shaping crypto legislation, and then, after leaving Congress, became vice chair of a crypto firm called Ondo Finance and a vocal advocate for the bill.
Okay. And who stands to profit the most from this, potential multi-trillion-dollar market the act helps legitimize?
It's really a mix, it seems. Big Wall Street players and Silicon Valley titans, established banks like Bank of America, Citibank, they're definitely poised to get into the regulated stablecoin game, developing their own project.
Makes sense.
Then you have the fintech and payment platforms like PayPal. They already launched their own stablecoin, PYUSD. Now they have a clearer federal path to expand. And of course, the crypto native firms themselves. Most notably, Circle, the issuer of USDC, and Tether, issuer of USDT. For them, getting this federal legitimacy is seen as the ultimate prize.
Even Tether, despite all the questions about their reserves and alleged money laundering.
Especially Tether, some critics would argue. They've faced those questions for years. Now, critics warn they have a pathway to operate within a U.S. framework that, again, those critics see as being full of loopholes.
Now, here's where it gets really interesting, according to some sources. There's this potential conflict of interest right at the top. The main political champion of the act, President Donald Trump, reportedly has a significant personal financial stake in crypto.
That's a critical point many sources highlight, yes. Financial disclosures show President Trump personally holds, well, the figure cited is at least $51 million worth of various cryptocurrencies.
$51 million. Wow.
And then there was the launch of his own branded meme coin, the Trump, unprecedented for a sitting president, with reports suggesting a planned new batch could add nearly $100 million more to his net worth. Plus, top Trump officials and nominees reportedly disclosed at least $193 million in personal crypto assets combined.
And there's a specific provision in the bill related to this.
Yes, and this is what critics point to as particularly damning. A provision in the stablecoin bill explicitly bans members of Congress and their families from profiting off stablecoins.
Okay, seems reasonable.
But that ban does not extend to the President of the United States.
Really?
Yes. Senator Warren, again a very vocal critic, stated bluntly on the record that the Genius Act will, quote, accelerate Trump's corruption because it supercharges a market from which he personally profits without that specific restriction applying to him.
Okay, so with all that momentum, the lobbying, the potential conflicts, who is pushing back? Who fought against this bill?
It was, by comparison, a much smaller group. Some lawmakers, consumer advocates, anti-corruption watchdogs.
Like Senator Warren.
Senator Warren was probably the most prominent and trenchant critic, yeah. Warning on the Senate floor about the lack of safeguards for consumers, national security, financial stability. Consumer groups like Consumer Reports also formally opposed it. They highlighted the lack of FDIC insurance, no guaranteed redemption rights, the weak audit rules we talked about.
Right.
And anti-corruption groups like Transparency International US warned it could usher in a new era of illicit finance, making it easier for kleptocrats, terrorists, sanctioned states to launder money.
And the passage itself was rushed.
That's how many described it. Pushed through during a crypto week in Congress. Reports surfaced of GOP leadership pressuring members to vote yes, which suggests to some a desire to minimize public debate and scrutiny.
Okay, let's broaden the lens again. Beyond just being a new asset, critics argue the Genius Act fundamentally changes the U.S. monetary landscape. How could it risk the stability of the U.S. dollar itself or the authority of the Federal Reserve?
Well, the core argument from critics is that it shatters the idea of a single, unified national currency.
How so?
By legitimizing this parallel system, where potentially dozens of private, for-profit companies can issue their own versions of the dollar. It leads to what's called monetary fragmentation.
So a dollar isn't just a dollar anymore.
Exactly. It could be a USDC dollar, a PayPal dollar,
Yeah.
an X money dollar, whatever comes next. And critics worry that in a crisis, these wouldn't all be treated equally. If one starts to lose its peg to the real dollar, it could create chaos. It just introduces this new layer of potential systemic risk into every transaction.
And how does that fragmentation potentially undermine the Fed's job of managing the economy?
Well, the Fed's main tool is influencing the banking system, right? Controlling interest rates, reserve requirements to manage lending and inflation.
Right.
Critics argue that widespread adoption of stablecoins threatens that directly. Some objections suggest the stablecoin market could swell to over $2 trillion.
$2 trillion?
Yeah. If a big chunk of that growth comes from people pulling deposits out of traditional banks and putting them into stablecoins, well, that weakens the foundation the Fed relies on to transmit its policies.
So less money in the banking system means the Fed's levers have less effect.
Precisely. Trillions of dollars operating outside the direct control of the banking system diminishes the Fed's ability to steer the economy, especially in a crisis.
What about the dollar's role globally? Its dominance, how does this play out?
This is where it gets really complex, kind of a paradox.
Okay.
In the short term, it might actually strengthen the dollar's global role. Why? Because over 99% of stablecoins are pegged to the dollar. And the act requires reserves to be held largely in U.S. assets, like treasuries.
So it creates huge demand for U.S. debt.
Exactly. Massive captive demand. And it projects this image of the U.S. leading in digital finance. So short-term win, maybe.
Yeah.
But critics say it's a perilous long-term gamble. By validating the whole concept of privately issued digital currencies, the U.S. is legitimizing a technology that could eventually be used to dethrone the dollar.
No.
Imagine a major U.S.-based stablecoin fails spectacularly. Fraud, mismanagement, whatever. The resulting crisis of confidence could permanently damage the digital dollar brand. That could incentivize the rest of the world to say, you know what, maybe we should look at non-dollar stablecoins or Bitcoin or something else entirely. It could fragment global liquidity and erode the very monetary power that's been a cornerstone of American influence for decades.
So short-term boost, long-term risk to dominance. And what about that risk of contagion we touched on? Before this act, crypto problems stayed mostly in crypto.
That's right. Critics argue that by formally integrating stablecoins so deeply, the act guarantees the next big crypto failure won't be contained.
Explain that.
Okay, imagine a run on a really big, systemically important stablecoin. The issuer is forced to sell its reserves to meet redemptions. What are those reserves? Mostly short-term U.S. Treasury bills.
Right.
So they suddenly have to dump hundreds of billions of dollars worth of treasuries onto the market. A fire sale.
What does that do?
It could destabilize the crucial money markets, where institutions lend to each other overnight. Trigger a liquidity crisis, basically. Credit freezes up.
Yeah.
That could spark panic in the traditional banking sector, which, as we've said, is now much more intertwined with these things.
So again, hardwiring crypto risk into the core financial system.
That's the core criticism, yes.
Now, you mentioned states acting on their own. Some see this federal law not just as a standalone thing, but as kind of the capstone on years of effort by some Republican-led states to build their own parallel financial infrastructure. What's been happening there?
Yeah, there's a clear pattern. If you look at certain states, a lot of pro-crypto legislation creating this network of states, basically competing to attract these businesses.
Like Texas?
Texas is a big one.
Yeah.
Huge hub for Bitcoin mining, partly because of its deregulated energy market.
Yeah.
And they passed a law to set up a Texas Strategic Bitcoin Reserve.
A state Bitcoin reserve. Okay.
Wyoming was early, creating those SPDI charters, special purpose depository institutions, basically crypto-friendly banks. And they're working on their own state stablecoin, the Wyoming stable token, for government payments.
Wow.
Arizona set up its own Bitcoin and digital assets reserve fund. New Hampshire actually passed a strategic Bitcoin reserve bill into law. Florida, we mentioned, considered letting its pension fund buy Bitcoin and letting people pay taxes in Bitcoin. Tennessee legally defined crypto as not being money under state law, creating its own classification.
So when you put all those pieces together, what's the bigger picture emerging from these states?
Well, critics look at this pattern and they call it monetary nullification.
Nullification, like defying federal law.
Kind of. A modern tech-driven version. A challenge to the federal government's constitutional power to coin money and regulate the value thereof. Think about it. By setting up their own Bitcoin reserves, these states are creating public treasuries outside the U.S. dollar system, outside the Fed's control. By creating their own payment tokens and crypto bank charters, they're building the plumbing for an alternative financial system. Some see it as a political project. Creating a red state financial ecosystem, maybe insulated from federal policies they disagree with.
And the Genius Act helps this along. Acts as an accelerator.
Absolutely, critics argue. The Act's creation of that dual federal-state regulatory system, that's seen as a huge political and legal win for these crypto-friendly states.
As so.
By officially sanctioning state-level oversight, the federal government basically legitimizes these parallel systems. It gives a legal roadmap for other states to follow suit, intensifying that race to the bottom. We talked about competing to offer the most lenient rules to attract the industry.
Okay, let's look outward. Globally. The Genius Act puts the U.S. on a pretty unique path, maybe a risky one, in the global race over the future of money. How does the U.S. approach differ from rivals like China or the EU?
Yeah, you're seeing what many describe as a kind of tripolar monetary system emerging, three distinct approaches.
Okay, what are they?
China is going full steam ahead with a state-controlled centralized digital yuan, the ECNY. It's seen largely as a tool of state power-enhancing surveillance, promoting the yuan internationally as an alternative to the dollar.
Right, top-down control.
Exactly, the EU. Their digital euro project seems more defensive. They're worried about their monetary sovereignty getting eroded by U.S. tech giants and all these dollar-backed stablecoins. Their regulation, called MiCA, is significantly tougher, more stringent than the Genius Act. Prioritizes stability, oversight.
And the U.S.?
The U.S., through the Genius Act and related executive orders, explicitly rejected doing a government-issued digital dollar, a CBDC. Instead, it chose to essentially outsource the digitization of the dollar to the private sector.
A gamble on innovation.
That's the proponent's frame. Leverage American innovation. Let the private sector lead. Critics see it as a high-stakes gamble. Can private companies really outcompete state-controlled models and lock in dollar dominance? The fundamental weakness, they argue, is ceding sovereign monetary control to for-profit companies. Their interests might not always align with U.S. national security. And if one of their stablecoins fails, it could trigger that crisis of confidence in the digital dollar itself.
What about sanctions evasions? Stablecoins seem almost designed for getting around financial blockades.
Yeah.
Pseudonymous, borderless.
It's seen as a direct threat, a threat to one of the most powerful tools of U.S. foreign policy.
Yeah.
Economic sanctions. Stablecoins look like an ideal tool for sanctioned regimes, terrorist groups, criminal networks to move money completely outside the traditional monitored banking system. Senator Warren, among others, has argued the bill just doesn't give the U.S. clear authority to enforce sanctions when adversaries use these dollar-backed stablecoins operating overseas. And anti-corruption groups point to this tether loophole, the idea that non-compliant foreign stablecoin issuers could still get access to U.S. markets indirectly through secondary trading, creating a huge blind spot.
And is there a risk of foreign adversaries actually infiltrating the U.S. system through this act?
Critics point to the provision dealing with foreign-issued stablecoins.
Yep.
They can be offered in the U.S. if their home country's regulations are deemed comparable to the U.S. rules.
Reciprocity, okay.
Right. Intended to foster an open market? Maybe. But critics see a significant national security vulnerability. Adversarial nations could potentially exploit this, use front companies or proxies based in friendly countries with light regulations to set up stablecoin issuers.
And if they get deemed comparable?
Then they'd have a direct gateway into the U.S. financial system, a new vector for economic espionage, market manipulation, maybe even funding covert operations inside the U.S.
Okay, let's drill down on national security and illicit finance. Proponents claim the act strengthens security, but critics say it actually empowers adversaries. How could stablecoins become like a new toolkit for terrorists and cartels?
Well, the very features that make them good for legitimate business speed, low cost, global reach, also make them powerful tools for bad actors.
Right.
And unlike Bitcoin or other volatile cryptos, stablecoins let these groups hold and move huge amounts of value across borders without worrying about the price crashing overnight. That makes them, as one report called it, the new kingpin of illicit crypto activity.
Are groups actually using them now?
Sources indicate yes. Designated terrorist groups like Hamas, ISIS, they've reportedly been using crypto, especially Tether, USDT, for years to fund operations. Congressional findings estimated hundreds of millions in crypto transactions linked to Hamas funding before the 2023 attacks. Networks in Asia apparently use USDT to funnel money to ISIS fighters. Critics argue that by legitimizing and massively expanding the whole stablecoin market, the Genius Act just makes it easier for these groups to raise and move funds.
But the Act does try to address this, right? It classifies issuers as financial institutions under the Bank Secrecy Act, subjects them to anti-money laundering rules, counter-terrorist financing rules, gives authorities the power to freeze illicit funds.
It does include those provisions, yes. But critics argue it's largely security theater.
Why theater?
Because those rules, the AML-CTF obligations, are applied very narrowly, primarily just to the centralized issuers of the stablecoins. But sophisticated criminals and terrorists, they don't park their money with the official issuer. They use the tools of decentralized finance, DeFi, non-custodial wallets they control themselves, decentralized exchanges, anonymizing mixers to hide the origin of the funds.
So the rules miss where the real action is happening.
That's the argument. Critics point to this huge DeFi loophole. Non-compliant stablecoins, maybe issued offshore, can still potentially access U.S. markets and users without those centralized controls. The Act, they say, fails to extend these critical obligations to all the necessary intermediaries, leaving lots of blind spots, and the power to freeze an account. It's useless if the criminals are operating in a part of the system the law doesn't effectively reach.
What about domestic threats inside the U.S.?
The pseudonymous nature of blockchain transactions, some argue, makes stablecoins potentially ideal for anonymously funding domestic extremist groups. Donors could fund groups without the paper trail you get with traditional banks.
Okay.
And similarly, foreign adversaries could potentially use stablecoins to covertly fund political disinformation campaigns or influence operations within the U.S., channeling money to activists or media outlets in ways that are really hard for intelligence agencies to trace and counter.
Let's talk taxes. Many financial experts are worried the Genius Act will basically blow up tax compliance, maybe even create a two-tiered system, one for the rich, one for everyone else. How does crypto tax work now, and how does the Act make it worse?
Okay, so under current U.S. law, the IRS treats crypto as property, not as currency.
Property, okay.
Which means every single time you sell, trade, or even use crypto, including stablecoins, to buy something, that's technically a disposition of property, a taxable event.
Every time, like buying a coffee.
Technically, yes.
Yes.
You're supposed to calculate your capital gain or loss on that tiny transaction and report it on Form 8949.
That sounds impossible to comply with.
It creates an immense compliance burden, yeah. And the IRS, frankly, lacks the resources to really enforce it effectively across the board.
So how does the Genius Act worsen this tax evasion?
Critics argue it will cause a geometric explosion in these hard-to-track taxable events. By pushing stablecoins into the mainstream for payments, it encourages potentially billions of new microtransactions happening on blockchains. Now, centralized exchanges, like Coinbase, they generally report transactions to the IRS. But crypto allows for peer-to-peer transfers, trades on decentralized exchanges. These happen completely outside those centralized choke points.
So invisible to the IRS?
Largely, yeah. The sheer volume and complexity, critics warn, will just swamp the IRS's ability to audit or enforce. And for sophisticated, wealthy individuals, this complexity isn't a bug, it's potentially a feature.
How so?
Stablecoins offer a potentially efficient way to evade taxes or move capital offshore. Large sums moved instantly across borders may be converted through decentralized platforms, stored in private, non-custodial wallets, achieving a level of secrecy that's impossible with traditional banks. Critics warn this creates a system where the wealthy can effectively opt out of taxes using technology, while the average person is stuck trying to navigate this incredibly complex and punitive regime.
Moving beyond pure finance, some suggest the Genius Act provides the raw material for financial apps designed to exploit human psychology, this gamification of finance. What is that exactly?
Yeah, this is a big trend. Many modern fintech apps, crypto trading apps, Robinhood, really pioneered a lot of this. They build their business model on gamification.
Using game-like features in finance.
Exactly. Things like points or rewards for making trades, celebratory animations, digital confetti, raining down when you buy the stock leaderboards, ranking traders, to encourage more activity by tapping into our desire for social comparison.
And these features aren't just fun, they actively exploit our cognitive biases, right?
Precisely. It's applied behavioral science. Many apps apparently use frameworks like Near Ale's hooked model trigger Action, variable reward. Investment designed specifically to build habits.
How does that work?
Push notifications act as the trigger. They prompt you to take an action, like making a trade. You get a variable reward, maybe a small gain, maybe a loss, the thrill of the unknown. That variability is key. It keeps you coming back. And that encourages more investment, more time, more money in the app. They also heavily leverage FOMO, fear of missing out. Constant alerts about market movements designed to make you feel like you need to act now, provoking impulsive trades. And that variable reward system, it activates dopamine circuits in the brain, just like gambling. It can create this powerful feedback loop leading to compulsive, even addictive, trading behavior.
And with AI, this gets even more targeted.
That's the next level, yeah. AI and predictive analytics can analyze your specific user behavior when you trade, what triggers you respond to, and then deliver tailored nudges designed to provoke your specific trading impulses. It moves beyond general gamification to highly individualized psychological targeting.
Which could lead to...
Critics warn it could lead to a new public health crisis. Financial addiction. These platforms, arguably, are designed to maximize trading volume because that's often how they make money, not necessarily to promote prudent long-term investing.
And how do stablecoins fit into this picture?
The Genius Act, by legitimizing stablecoins, makes them the perfect table stakes for this digital casino, as critics describe it. They're marketed as safe, stable, one-to-one digital dollars, so it feels risk-free to deposit your real money and convert it.
Easy onboarding.
Exactly. But once your funds are converted into stablecoins on the platform, you're inside the casino. And that's where the platform's psychological arsenal can go to work, nudging you away from your safe stablecoin and into highly speculative things. Meme coins, leveraged crypto derivatives, whatever drives more trading volume.
Okay, let's talk about the physical world impact. Stablecoins seem digital, clean. But there's a hidden environmental cost, right? Even if stablecoins themselves aren't mined.
That's right. While stablecoins themselves don't use energy-intensive mining like Bitcoin, their widespread adoption, critics argue, fuels the entire crypto ecosystem, including the energy-hungry parts.
Primarily Bitcoin mining's proof of work.
Exactly. Bitcoin's proof-of-work system consumes a staggering amount of electricity, comparable to entire countries, like Argentina. And that massive energy demand is increasingly being located here in the U.S., particularly in states with already fragile or overburdened power grids.
Like Texas.
Texas is a prime example. Reports indicate crypto mining companies there have applied for permits requesting nearly 42 gigawatts of electricity.
42 gigawatts. How much is that?
It's enough to power over 8.3 million Texas homes during peak summer demand.
Wow.
So this huge new industrial load strains the grid, critics say, increases the risk of blackouts, especially during extreme weather like heat waves or freezes, and it can drive up electricity costs for regular residential customers.
And the miners seem to be targeting specific states, ones with deregulated energy, maybe lax environmental rules.
It appears to be the playbook, yes. There's been a legislative push in states like Wyoming to create special deregulated zones, specifically for crypto miners, allowing them to bypass certain rules, certain costs, potentially socializing those costs onto the public grid and ratepayers.
What about greenwashing? The industry often claims it helps stabilize the grid or uses renewables.
Yeah, that claim is made, but critics often argue the reality is the opposite. Mining needs constant 247 power. It can't rely solely on intermittent renewables like solar or wind.
So what happens?
So this huge constant demand actually provides a financial lifeline, critics say, to aging, often inefficient fossil fuel power plants, especially coal and natural gas that might otherwise be scheduled for retirement.
So it props up fossil fuels.
That's the argument. And in Texas, during heat waves, there have been reports of miners being paid tens of millions of dollars in energy credits, basically subsidies funded by other ratepayers, to shut down their operations temporarily to free up power for the grid.
Wait, they get paid not to mine?
Yes. So, critics argue, the public pays the miners to help alleviate the very grid instability that their massive energy consumption helped create in the first place. The Genius Act, by fueling overall crypto growth, indirectly subsidizes the fossil fuel sector and transfers wealth from regular households to mining corporations.
Let's circle back to consumer protection, or the lack thereof. Consumer advocates say the Genius Act creates a system where people are stripped of protections they take for granted with banks. What's this illusion of safety around FDIC insurance?
Well, the law is crystal clear on this. Unambiguous. Stablecoins are not bank deposits. They are not protected by FDIC insurance.
So if the issuer goes bankrupt.
The U.S. government has no legal obligation to refund consumers.
Right.
Period. Unlike your regular bank account, which is insured up to $250,000.
But some issuers advertise pass-through FDIC insurance? What's that?
Right. That means the issuer holds some of its cash reserves in regular bank accounts that are FDIC insured, usually large omnibus accounts.
So that protects the stablecoin holder?
Not directly and not completely. Experts explain it's complex, indirect. It only applies to the cash portion of the reserves, not reserves held in treasury bills or other assets. And how that pass-through insurance would actually work in a chaotic bankruptcy, whether the end consumer would definitely get their share back, it's largely untested and certainly not guaranteed.
Okay, so no real insurance. What about recourse if something goes wrong? The issuer collapses or your wallet gets hacked.
Critics say there's virtually none. While the Act makes issuers disclose their redemption policies, it mostly fails to mandate a specific, legally enforceable time frame for getting your money back.
Meaning?
Meaning, during a panic, a run on the stablecoin, the company could legally just delay or suspend redemptions indefinitely. Your money is trapped.
Okay. And hacks. Scams.
Here's another big gap critics point to. The Act largely fails to apply core consumer protection laws, like the Electronic Fund Transfer Act, EFTA, to stablecoin transactions.
What does EFT do?
EFT is what protects you with your debit card or bank transfers. If there's an unauthorized transaction, you have rights, a process to dispute it, limits on your liability.
Right.
Without EFT applying to stablecoins, if your wallet gets hacked and drained, or you get tricked by a phishing scam into sending your coins away,
Yeah.
those funds are just gone permanently. There's no bank to call, no established legal process for recovery.
So it's all on the individual user to protect themselves.
Exactly. Critics describe it as a radical privatization of consumer protection. The burden of due diligence assessing the issuer's solvency, their security measures, is shifted entirely onto the individual, which is an impossible task for almost everyone except maybe sophisticated financial experts.
And yet, despite this explicit lack of government insurance, some critics argue a taxpayer bailout of the industry is still almost inevitable. Why the contradiction?
Yeah, it's what some call the bitter irony of the situation.
Okay.
By integrating stablecoins so deeply into the financial system, which the Genius Act encourages, critics argue, it ensures that the failure of a major issuer would pose a systemic risk, a risk to the whole economy.
Like we discuss it with contagion.
Exactly. And as the government's intervention during the Silicon Valley bank collapse showed when they stepped in to save Circle's reserve, regulators, many believe, simply will not allow a systemically important financial institution to fail if they fear that kind of contagion.
So the market knows the government will blink.
The market now operates under the probably correct assumption that the government will step in if things get bad enough. And that, critics say, creates the ultimate moral hazard. Stablecoin issuers can chase profits, take risks, knowing implicitly that the American taxpayer is serving as their uncompensated, involuntary insurer of last resort.
Okay, one more critical angle. Executive power. Some see this law creating a potentially dangerous new tool for presidential authority, especially using emergency powers. How could it be weaponized?
Well, the President of the United States already has significant emergency powers through existing laws, right?
Right.
Like the National Emergencies Act, NEA, the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, IEEPA.
Used for sanctions, mostly.
Historically, yes, for sanctions or major crises like COVID-19. They allow the president to unilaterally declare a national emergency, which then unlocks over 120 statutory powers. Things like freezing financial assets, controlling international transactions, even seizing private property, all with very minimal congressional oversight. And sometimes they've been used controversially to get around Congress on other issues.
So how does the Genius Act fit into this? How does it affect those powers?
Critics argue the Act creates this new centralized pressure point within the financial system that's uniquely vulnerable to these emergency powers. It requires that all permitted stablecoin issuers must have the technical ability to comply with lawful orders, including the ability to freeze, block, or even destroy tokens in any user's wallet.
A kill switch, basically.
Effectively, yes. Now, the intention stated is for law enforcement, national security freezing terrorist funds, for example.
Right.
But critics warn this capability can easily be transformed into a tool of political control. Imagine a president declares an emergency citing maybe economic instability, domestic unrest, whatever. They could then issue executive orders compelling stablecoin issuers to freeze the assets of political opponents, protesters, journalists,
Wow.
or suspend redemptions for everyone, trapping trillions in the system, or even seize the reserve assets of an issuer deemed to be acting against the national interest.
So it turns stablecoins into a potential tool for financial surveillance and control.
Activated by a single individual in the executive branch, critics argue, concentrating immense, largely unaccountable power. The supposedly decentralized crypto world could, in an emergency, become subject to highly centralized, politically motivated government authority.
Finally, there's a suggestion that the Genius Act isn't just about crypto, that it might be the financial services beachhead for a much broader political agenda. Project 2025, what is Project 2025, and what's its plan for finance?
Right. Project 2025 is this initiative organized by the Heritage Foundation. It's produced a massive 920-page blueprint for fundamentally reshaping the U.S. government if there's a conservative administration. And a big part of that is a sweeping campaign of financial deregulation.
What are the main goals there?
Key objectives include abolishing the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, the CFPB, repealing the Dodd-Frank Act, that big reform package passed after the 2008 crisis, weakening the independence of the SEC and the Federal Reserve, and generally shifting towards a very light-touch regulatory philosophy based mainly on just disclosure and punishing fraud after it happens, rather than trying to prevent risks proactively.
Okay, so how does the Genius Act, according to critics, align with that bigger Project 2025 agenda?
Well, what's fascinating or alarming, depending on your view, is how the Genius Act seems to function almost like a pilot program for this radical deregulatory vision.
A pilot program?
Yeah, using the new world of crypto as a kind of testing ground to implement principles that might be harder politically to apply directly to traditional banking right away.
How so? Give me specifics.
Okay. One, it deliberately carves out stablecoins, which are basically a core consumer payment product from the CFPB's jurisdiction. That directly achieves a key Project 2025 goal, weakening the CFPB. Two, it sets up that light-touch regulatory system for stablecoin issuers we talked about. Much weaker, critics say, than Dodd-Frank standards for banks. Relies heavily on that disclosure-based philosophy Heritage favors. And three, by creating this parallel private currency system, operating somewhat outside the direct control of the traditional banking sector, the Act starts to erode the Federal Reserve's central role in the monetary system. Another key long-term objective cited in Project 2025.
So the argument is the Genius Act isn't just about stablecoins. It's potentially a Trojan horse for broader deregulation.
That's exactly the argument many critics make. It's seen as a strategic first move. It's often easier to establish weak regulations for a new industry than it is to repeal strong existing regulations from an entrenched one like traditional banking.
Set a precedent?
Precisely. By establishing this relatively deregulated template for what could be a multi-trillion-dollar stablecoin market, the Act creates a powerful precedent. Proponents of deregulation can then argue down the line, look, if this light-touch model is safe enough for the digital dollar, why do we need all these burdensome Dodd-Frank rules for regular banks?
So, using the allure of crypto innovation to dismantle the post-2008 regulatory framework.
That's the critical perspective, yes. That the Genius Act serves as the Trojan horse for the entire Project 2025 financial agenda.
So after all that, what does this mean for you listening to this, trying to navigate this incredibly fast-changing financial world? We've unpacked the Genius Act from its roots in that crypto Wild West, through its complicated rules to its potential impacts on everything from your retirement savings to the whole U.S. economy, even global power.
Yeah.
We've seen how it legitimizes this whole new class of digital currency, but also how critics warn it could expose you to completely new kinds of risk, new avenues for fraud, maybe even unforeseen uses of executive power.
It really raises a fundamental question, doesn't it? In this new era, where maybe even your retirement savings are being eyed by what some call a digital casino, and where private companies can create their own digital dollars without all the traditional safeguards, how do you even define financial security anymore? And maybe more importantly, who do you trust to ultimately control the money in your wallet?
Definitely something for you to mull over as you think about the future of finance and what it really takes to be well-informed in a world changing this quickly. We'll certainly continue to keep an eye on these developments and bring you the insights you need to understand the big picture.